There's a bad habit in national security debates. If an operation sounds too hard, too risky, or too politically uncomfortable, people sometimes dismiss it as fantasy. That may appear responsible, but it can also be lazy, because a lot of what special operations forces do looks impossible right up until the moment it happens. That doesn't mean every commando raid is a good idea, and it doesn't mean every risky military option should be used. And it definitely doesn't mean a raid against Iranian nuclear infrastructure would be simple. It wouldn't be. But calling that kind of option fantasy misses something important about why special operations forces exist in the first place. Recently, the Cato Institute published a criticism of a possible United States special operations raid against Iranian nuclear infrastructure. The argument was that the so-called commando option was closer to fantasy than feasibility. There are fair points in that criticism. Iran is not a permissive environment. Its nuclear infrastructure includes hardened facilities, complicated geography, air defenses, internal security forces, and the real possibility of escalation. But difficulty isn't the same thing as fantasy. Difficulty is the problem set. And special operations forces are designed to operate inside difficult problem sets. That's the whole point. The debate over Iran usually gets trapped between two bad choices. On one side, do nothing. On the other side, launch a large-scale war. But serious strategy requires more imagination than that. Special operations forces provide options between diplomacy and invasion. Those options may be dangerous, they may be politically risky, they may never be used. But having them is critical. Military planning isn't the same thing as political intent. A plan sitting on a shelf doesn't mean the president is going to order it tomorrow. It means the military has done its job by thinking through what might be required if the strategic environment changes. And it can change fast. A regime can collapse. A stockpile can become vulnerable. A nuclear site can become unstable. Sensitive materials can suddenly become the priority. In that kind of moment, the United States doesn't want to begin thinking from zero. It wants options. That's what professional militaries do. They plan for ugly contingencies before those contingencies occur. Now, critics are right about one thing. Special operations forces can't do everything. They're not magic. A small team can't simply parachute into a hardened nuclear facility, grab hundreds of pounds of enriched uranium, and vanish like something out of a bad action movie. That's not how real operations work. A mission like that could require intelligence preparation, cyber support, aviation, suppression of enemy air defenses, engineers, blocking forces, extraction plans, deception, logistics, and a political decision-maker willing to accept enormous consequences if something goes wrong. That's a serious undertaking, and it might not be worth the risk. But again, that's the real debate. Not whether the option sounds impossible. The real debate is whether the objective justifies the risk. And that distinction is the key. History is full of operations that sounded impossible before they happened. For example, the Doolittle Raid in World War II didn't look like it could change the military balance against Japan. And in purely material terms, it didn't. But psychologically, strategically, and politically, it had an impact. Operation Entebbe, the Israeli hostage rescue in Uganda in 1976, sounded almost absurd on paper. Fly thousands of miles, land in hostile territory, rescue hostages, kill the terrorists, and get out. Until it worked. Operation Neptune Spear, the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, was also not some clean, guaranteed mission. American helicopters penetrated Pakistani airspace and landed in a populated city near a major military academy. One of those helicopters crashed. The team had to adapt on the objective. If that operation had failed, a lot of people would now be saying it was reckless from the beginning. But because it succeeded, it became a case study. That's how these things often work. Before success, they're called fantasy. After success, they're called doctrine. More recent examples make the same point. Israel's pager attack against Hezbollah wasn't a traditional commando raid, but it was a reminder of what intelligence preparation, patience, deception, and technical imagination can do to an adversary. Operation Absolute Resolve, the United States raid that seized Nicolas Maduro, is another example of an operation that would have sounded implausible if discussed publicly beforehand. That doesn't mean every future operation will work, but it does mean we should be careful about treating our own lack of imagination as proof of impossibility. There's a difference between skepticism and intellectual laziness. Skepticism asks hard questions. What is the objective? What intelligence do we have? What forces are required? What happens if the operation fails? What happens if it succeeds? What are the second and third order consequences? Those are good questions, and they're necessary. But simply saying fantasy shuts the conversation down before the hard analysis even begins. And that creates its own danger, because if policymakers are told that unconventional options are fantasy, then they're left with a narrow menu. Do nothing, or go big. That is a bad way to think about national power. Special operations forces exist precisely because the world doesn't always give us clean choices. They give decision-makers tools that are smaller than invasion, faster than conventional mobilization, and sometimes more politically usable than overt military escalation. Again, that doesn't make them easy or even low risk. And it doesn't make them necessarily wise, but it does make them strategically relevant. The job of special operations isn't to make war simple. The job is to create asymmetric advantage where conventional approaches are too slow, too costly, too visible, or too blunt. That's why these forces exist. Not to do the easy thing, but to prepare for the thing most people assume can't be done. So when we talk about a potential commando option against Iran, the serious answer isn't chest thumping. It's not fantasy either. The serious answer is this. Maybe it's feasible, maybe it isn't. Maybe the risk is justified under extreme circumstances, maybe it isn't. But dismissing it out of hand misunderstands both military planning and the history of special operations. Professional militaries plan for hard things. Responsible policymakers decide whether those hard things are worth doing. Those are not the same job, and we shouldn't confuse them. The lesson is simple. Everything special operations forces do looks impossible until it happens. That isn't a flaw in the concept. That's the reason the capability exists. Calling difficult operations fantasy might make for a clean headline, but it doesn't make for serious strategy. The real question is never whether the mission sounds impossible. The real question is whether the objective is important enough, the plan is solid enough, and the nation is prepared to live with the consequences. That's the debate worth having. Read this article and others at the Havok Journal. The link is in the description.